It's really a privilege to be here speaking about this very briefly today, as has been observed, a really opportune time. I'm going to take you on a fairly visual journey fairly quickly about remote sensing, looking down, and Jane's going to be angry if I go over time, so it'll be fairly speedy. We've heard about how inspirational it is to look at space. We've heard how inspirational space engineering and enterprise is, yet astronauts who go into space, and we have one here whom you can consult, will almost always talk about how moved they are and how inspired they are when they look back at Earth from space, when they observe Earth as a sole planet in space, a fragile, beautiful place that we live. And this image is, of course, famous. It's called Earthrise. It was taken on Christmas Eve in 1968. It wasn't planned to be taken, but the astronauts were taking it anyway. It's said to be the most important environmental photograph ever taken. Perhaps that's one of the reasons that many satellites have since been launched to observe Earth. And this is not to scale. We have constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit capturing data, measuring our atmosphere, our oceans, and our lands. That's produced things like this image of Australia through programs like the Landsat satellite, which celebrates this year, or this week, in fact, the director of the United States Geological Survey is in Alice Springs, celebrating 40 years of cooperation with Australia on the Landsat series. The efforts are held together through international networks of people and infrastructure, which is what this dish symbolises in Alice Springs, and it's being painted with colours that are of significance to the Native American people in the Sioux Falls area of the US. I would love to spend time talking about all the leadership that Australians have done in Earth observation, but it's just not possible given the time available. So let me go straight to what's really exciting about this area at this point in time. Everybody's heard about these remote sensing satellites. Frankly, the supply chain that links those satellites to decisions has never really matured. The supply chain, I mean, on the left we have satellites taking measurements, on the right we have people making decisions. If you look at something like positioning satellites, when I get into an Uber, the driver and I are both using a satellite to know where we are. Neither of us know about it or have to know about it. There's nothing equivalent in this land remote sensing, this looking down, or hasn't been so far. But now we're starting to understand what that supply chain looks like, and it's starting to transform the way in which we're using and will use these satellites and their information. So it hasn't happened before because it's more complicated and more difficult to do. But after more than 10 years of effort, we're just getting there now. The first step is that now these satellites are not science missions anymore. They're synoptic operational missions capturing high science quality data run in an ongoing sense by the European Space Agency and the United States Geological Survey and other international space organisations. The data are free. They're unlicensed, so they're open licensed. Anyone can leverage them. And they're going to continue. That makes a huge difference. What that does, though, is produce a problem with data. These data are not easy to use. They have a lot of noise in them, they have clouds in them. So the next step that's been taken, based on some really leading work from Australia and other countries over the last decade, is that the satellite operators are now starting to produce these data, not as raw images, but as ready-to-use measurements. And this concept of analysis-ready data has emerged and been endorsed through the international community, where these satellites are producing primary measurements of the land surface. The reflectance of the land surface, its temperature, its roughness. And the word measurement is really important because it's allowed this community to start moving into a quantitative science field rather than a qualitative analysis. That then leaves a huge problem with big data. How do you actually manage all the data that you now have available and ready to use? And an Australian innovation, the Open Data Cube, is actually provided the solution to that. So now we're seeing something that Australia made being taken up globally, hence the Africa maps there. And roughly it looks like this. That's how a satellite sees the Earth, a bunch of strips which are continually building up over time. It's not a good way to work with data. Computers like to work with data in this sort of format. And so the Open Data Cube paradigm, and you'll hear about the Data Cube if you talk to anyone in Earth observation, pretty much globally now, is that the data are restructured or indexed into something which is geographically regular and stacked as a time series. Every pixel in every image is calibrated. It's flagged according to whether it's a good observation or has a cloud in it. and the time series is used so that one can integrate or differentiate through time, a bit of an inspiration from the astronomical community there, and actually extract far more information than has ever been possible before. This was invented in 2013 when these data were processed in this way to produce the first map of Australian surface water for the National Flood Risk Information Program that was running at that time. So this map, which shows areas where there's rarely water in red, they're floodplains, through to areas where there's persistent water in green and blue, was a world first. Nobody had done anything like this before. There's something like 10 to the 14 actual observations going into that particular map. And it's now a continental product which is updated every month as new data come in, with wide ramifications. So, and underlying that are a series of measurements. That particular image is not an image, that is actually the median surface reflectance of Australia in winter in 2014, visualised in a red, green, blue map. So this supply chain is starting to work, it's starting to be filled out. The last part is how that connects with decision makers, not just decision makers in government, but all across all sectors. And that's a process of building opportunities that can allow a user community, an ecosystem is the emerging word, and I'm a forester, so that's okay with me, an ecosystem of users to engage with the opportunities presented by these continental products that are being produced a little bit like the Weather Service produces maps of surface of temperature for the day. It's not just about water, a little side here. This particular, what I'm showing here is that there's a little black square in the middle of that image. For that black square, what's being measured from the same satellites using an algorithm developed in Australia is how much green vegetation there is in that spot versus how much bare earth or dry vegetation. And that's being tracked through time from the late 1980s through to present, showing a signal, and the signal corresponds to a cropping regime, a wheat crop, and then it changes in the early 2000s through to a more persistent green as they change the crops to almonds. Implications for water use. The important thing is that that analysis can be done everywhere in Australia and every day and provided to everyone. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So we now have a really exciting opportunity here where this supply chain, as I said, is starting to work. And I want to talk now about what does that mean? Well, sorry, one aside. Geoscience Australia has been funded to maintain that as an operational capability going forward. And that's Geoscience Australia's Digital Earth Australia program. Enough said on that. So what does this mean, making space for Australia? What does it mean in this context? And I think it has a number of implications. Start with government. With government, it means there starts to be this regular and available and authoritative evidence base that can inform decisions in the environment in a way that's never been done before. This one's fairly contentious, and you might have seen it in the media. This one's less contentious, and I'll talk to it. Here's a map that the New South Wales government produces every month. They produce a State of the Drought report. This map is one of the maps they produce. It's showing for every parish in New South Wales what the status of the farm dams is compared to normal. And it's based on an analysis of those satellite data that I showed you, which is automatically generated, compares how big the surface of the dam is to normal based on the history, and produces this map, adds it up by parish, and they produce this map. Things like that which are not even anticipated, and let alone when the satellite were launched, are what's going to make this have real impact, and what's starting to make it have real impact. For researchers, it's really cool. So researchers in this area traditionally spent 80% of their time wrangling data, correcting data, finding it, getting it, putting it on their computer, and correcting it. This is some feedback I got from Norm Campbell, whom many of you may know, who ran Maths and Stats in Perth in CSIRO, when we provided him some ready-to-use calibrated data. He got it straight away. This saved time and let him focus on the research question, what are the processes that are happening, how are people interacting with those processes, the hard questions. More enthusing, students. We're now at a point where students who are not remote sensing specialists can engage with these data sets and do things that they just couldn't do before. So a couple of years ago, Emma Johnson from UNSW and myself got together and we created a little collaboration, and Anna Bunot, her student, produced an assessment of the water quality in all the estuaries around Australia and published it. And someone in the conference that Emma was at took this photo and sent it back to me saying, check this out, they're using our data to do this wonderful research. So students can now engage with this and use it as a resource, and they are doing that. And more exciting still, consortia of researchers are starting to use the same data and do things that haven't been done before. This is a methodology for mapping mangroves that's been agreed by a national consortium, and what you're seeing is an annual update of the mangroves in this particular part of the coast, which changes through time. It expands up till about 2013, and then in some areas of the coast there was a massive dieback, which you'll see in a moment, as the coastal area contracts to be virtually nothing, all of which can be quantified. But then it can be scaled up, so that can be done for the whole country. So for the first time, having spoken about it for decades, we now have a national assessment of mangroves. On the horizontal axis of those graphs is time, from the late 80s to present. The vertical axis is area of mangroves, so you're seeing how the total area changes. And the light green, the middle green, the dark green are the density of canopy covers. So we have national assessments of things which previously were theoretically possible, but completely unaffordable, and couldn't be agreed on the methodologies. I think it's really interesting to look at what this means for industry. Industry can now engage with these data sources, whereas previously it was too expensive and too difficult. The data may have been free and open, but actually having the expertise and going through the process of getting them, working with them, was an overhead that small to medium enterprises like Spatial Vision, even though they're mature companies, wouldn't contemplate for a normal size of a product. They can now get these data from Geoscience Australia as an operational agency and leverage them as they see fit. Other industries, more exciting. This is a company called SIBO Labs based in Toowoomba, who are taking, earlier I talked about that agricultural product. That map there is that agricultural product. It's produced on an almost daily update by Geoscience Australia, and it shows how much of the ground is bare earth versus which is the red, I think, and the green is green vegetation, and the purple is dry vegetation. They take that as an input, then they do that to it. They make it into a pasture biomass map, then they add that up by paddocks, and then they feed it to their farmers as an app, as a piece of information that they can use to modify and optimise their land management. So when there was a closure to the US government, Christmas Eve last year, I think, we had a bit of a glitch at our end because we rely on them. These guys noticed straight away, and we had somebody fixing it because they were actually using this in an operational context in the commercial setting. So innovators are getting into these data sets. I think equally exciting is what it means for these small satellites. So we heard today about companies putting up tiny satellites. This is a handheld video, hence the shake, I took in California in August at a conference where companies like Planet, who make these tiny satellites, hundreds of them, were talking about how they're working and what they're doing. And what they're demonstrating here is that they will use the infrastructure of these government satellites that are highly calibrated as a baseline. So they will take the weekly satellite observations from the United States Geological Survey, or in this case from the European Space Agency, and match their data to that very accurately. So they can then provide 1 metre resolution every day updates, but they can have the authority of it being corrected in a way which is consistent with the government science agencies. So this is really enabling them to move forward as a capability that is relevant to anybody who's using these satellite data. So it's a really exciting ecosystem coming forward. Most importantly, and I think last slide of all, what does it mean nationally? Maybe one or two. Nationally, what this means is we have billion-dollar economies growing on these data. We have a lot at stake here. And our primary interest over the last decade or so has been how do we ensure that these data flows continue, and all that means, everything around that. And there's at least 3 ways in which we can and need to do that. We do a lot of leadership in international forums. So this week in Canberra, there's a ministerial forum of the Group on Earth Observations hosted by Australia, multiple international delegations there. And that's a good thing. That's talking about Australia giving back and helping the community. I co-chair something with Alex Held from CSIRO and the most powerful committee on this Committee on Earth Observing Satellites for a couple of years, where we get to talk to people who operate billion-dollar budgets, unlike us, with satellites. We have to look also at investing in the upstream section. We have to get something into space so that we've got a real seat at the table of these capabilities. Instruments on satellites that we need, that are useful to others, and that grow our industry are the way to do that. And most important of all, or most impactful of all, is contributing our ideas internationally. And this slide indicates that. We're now taking algorithms, that thing on the right is the water algorithm we use in Australia, and applying it to whole new continents, in this case Africa, as of last weekend, taking the software into the Amazon cloud. And so now we have the ability to go to Tanzania and look at how water's changed there, and we can expose that to anyone in Africa and they can use it as they see fit and guide its future development. So we're at a really exciting time in Earth observation looking down. Not all the inspiration's up. My counterparts in NASA only have $3 billion budgets, but they're still great people to work with. When they've got 3 orders of magnitude more money than you have, you don't have to do much to have some good friends. So thank you all.